Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into what our sources are calling, well, the decisive geopolitical battleground of 2025. And the scale of foreign interference they're talking about is truly staggering. Moldovan authorities estimate Moscow is ready to pour in up to 200 million. That's roughly double the country's entire annual defense budget just to subvert one election.
Yeah, and that figure, 200 million, it isn't just, a budget line item. It represents a really comprehensive, full-scale plan. Our source material lays out this coordinated campaign. We're talking massive voter bribery schemes, illicit cash moving through crypto, and even training local provocateurs. The goal,
Yeah.
to incite violent unrest after the election. This is way beyond traditional political meddling.
Absolutely. And that's why this deep dive is so crucial because, look, this isn't just some internal political contest in a small country. Our sources, this whole stack we have, they define the upcoming Moldovan election as, like, the key factor for Europe's future security setup.
It really is. And what's fascinating, or maybe alarming, is understanding the scope of this threat. It's being described as an unprecedented hybrid war, orchestrated directly by the Kremlin. So our mission today for you listening is to reveal the entire playbook, from the digital deception, the sophisticated dirty money, and then analyze the three distinct scenarios that could play out. These could either solidify Europe's eastern flank or, and this is critical, create a brand new active threat right against Ukraine's vital port of Odessa.
Right. Let's start with the basics. It's a strategic geography. Why Moldova? Why is this small, landlocked nation suddenly so critical to global security right now?
Well, it's all about location, 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 right? It's a geography.
Yeah.
Moldova is wedged directly between Ukraine on one side and Romania, a NATO and EU member, on the other. So this parliamentary election, set for September 28, 2025, it's essentially become a national referendum, a referendum on the country's entire geopolitical destiny.
And the choice facing voters seems pretty stark, almost existential.
It is, absolutely. The country basically has two paths. Either cement its current move towards the EU, aiming for membership maybe by 2030, or, if a pro-Russian government takes over, risk what analysts are calling the Belarusification of the state.
Okay, Belarusification, that's a pretty loaded term. For our listeners, what does that actually mean in practice for Moldova?
It means the systematic dismantling of real sovereignty. Think about Belarus under Lukashenko, right? Political repression, foreign policy, totally aligned with Moscow, basically complete subservience to the Kremlin's strategic playbook. For Moldova, this would mean becoming a permanent client state politically and maybe even militarily.
And if that happens, the consequences for Kiev, for Ukraine, are huge. Moldova's political direction is critical for Ukraine's war effort, particularly for keeping the port of Odessa secure.
Precisely. A pro-Russian regime setting up shop in Chișinău would instantly flip Moldova. It goes from being a neutral, maybe slightly helpful neighbor to an active security threat. It effectively gives the Kremlin a new launch pad. For hybrid attacks on the EU, yes, but also putting direct pressure on Ukraine's western side.
Now, the current government, the pro-European one, is Action and Solidarity, PAS, led by President Maia Sandu. Their pivot towards the West has been, well, pretty remarkable. They got EU candidate status in 2022, and just this year, formally opened accession talks. That's fast.
And that speed, that decisive shift away from Russia's traditional influence, that's exactly why Moscow has escalated things to this level, why it's a full-blown hybrid war. The Kremlin sees the success of a pro-European Moldova, especially one led by PAS, as an existential threat to its whole regional control model.
Okay, let's dig into that hybrid war effort then, because the sources are clear. This is like a laboratory for techniques that can be replicated across Europe. If you start with the money, the financial angle, how are they moving these staggering amounts of illicit cash?
Well, we're seeing what the sources call electoral corruption, just on a massive scale. The main pipeline for these funds seems to be the network run by the fugitive oligarch Ilan Shor. He's orchestrating huge amounts of money for, direct vote buying and funding protests.
And I noticed the sources really emphasize the sophistication now. It's not just bags of cash anymore. They're heavily using cryptocurrencies to get around banking controls, judicial oversight.
Right, that points to how they're professionalizing this. It's a long game. Look at the data. Back in 2024, one scheme allegedly moved $15 million. That money reportedly reached about 130,000 Moldovans. That's already 10% of the active voters getting paid off.
Wait a second. If $15 million allegedly influenced 10% of the electorate in 2024, what exactly does Moscow expect to achieve with a budget potentially up to $200 million for 2025? That's over 10 times more.
That kind of budget signals an intent to completely paralyze the democratic process itself, either by, trying to buy an outright win for their proxies, or maybe more likely just ensuring enough votes get siphoned off to stop any pro-European majority from forming. It's a targeted effort to make the whole election seem illegitimate.
Which brings us neatly from the financial warfare to the information war. The sources describe this disinformation flood as unprecedented. What specific tactics are we seeing online?
It's definitely a multi-pronged digital assault. They're using sophisticated AI-powered bots, and not just to spam comments, but to absolutely flood social media platforms, drowning out real political discussion with anti-government, anti-EU stuff.
And we're also seeing this specific thing called Operation Overload. It's apparently part of the bigger, quite notorious Doppelganger campaign, designed specifically to overwhelm Moldovan fact-checkers.
That's right. The goal is simply volume. Hit the country with so much junk, so much false content, that the people trying to verify information just get operationally paralyzed. They can't keep up. Our sources noted that in Q2 2025, this operation hit Moldova harder than any other country. It's like they're field testing denial of service attacks, but aimed at truth itself.
And the actual content, the narratives they push, are very specific, tailored to exploit real fears, real cultural sensitivities.
Oh, definitely. They hammer away at domestic anxieties. Big one. Claiming the PAS government plans to rig the election. That's a preemptive strike against the democratic process itself. They also play on traditional loyalties, pushing accusations that the government is persecuting the Orthodox Church. And finally, really targeted, often quite nasty, gender-based disinformation attacks against President Sandu personally, trying to peel away conservative and rural voters.
Yeah, and the challenge for the pro-European side, for PAS, is definitely made worse by genuine domestic frustration. Russia is cleverly exploiting this, not just with their obvious pro-Russian proxies, but also with these so-called spoiler parties. Parties designed specifically to just fracture the pro-EU vote.
That's spot on. Despite PAS's big wins on the geopolitical stage, the EU track, they face real, widespread public frustration at home. Reform fatigue is a huge factor, especially over the slow progress on justice reform. When people don't see high-profile oligarchs convicted, it feeds cynicism. And then there's just a lack of tangible improvements in daily life, salaries, pensions.
And that frustration, that discontent, is showing up directly in the polls. Surveys suggest PAS is very likely going to lose the outright majority they won back in 2021, which means they'll need to form a coalition, and that always brings instability.
Right, so you've got the main openly pro-Russia opposition, that's the Patriotic Electoral Bloc, BEP. They explicitly want to ditch the EU path, restore ties with Moscow. They're strong in rural areas and in the autonomous region of Gagauzia. But the real complication, the tricky part, is this alternative bloc. It's led by the mayor of Chișinău,
Alternativa, yeah. They position themselves as nominally pro-European, but they are fiercely anti-incumbent. They just attack PAS relentlessly on domestic failures. It feels like they're walking a very fine line.
And this is where the analysis from our sources gets really sharp. The overwhelming consensus is that Alternativa isn't just another opposition party. It's seen as a calculated spoiler project, likely designed or at least encouraged by Moscow. The goal isn't necessarily for the main pro-Russia bloc, BEP, to win outright. It's to achieve political paralysis.
Okay, help us unpack that political paralysis. If the pro-Russian parties don't actually take power, why is a messy, fragmented parliament still a win for the Kremlin?
Because instability is cheap, and it's incredibly effective for them. If the pro-EU vote gets split across several parties and PAS can't form a stable, working coalition, what happens? Reforms grind to a halt. The EU accession process slows down. And you get this power vacuum, which is just ripe for Russian exploitation for influence peddling. This state of, let's call it managed chaos, keeps Moldova perpetually weak and off balance. It achieves Moscow's main strategic goal, preventing a successful, stable, pro-Western Moldova without the political cost of installing a full-on puppet regime.
And there's even some hard evidence pointing in this direction, isn't there? Analysts connect the dots back to Alternativa's leader Ayan Seban being recently denied entry into Romania and the Schengen zone on security grounds.
Yeah, that travel ban is significant. It suggests that key NATO and EU intelligence services see his political activities, maybe his funding sources, as being fundamentally linked to Russian efforts to undermine the Moldovan state. Regardless of his public, nominally pro-European statements, the fact that the EU is taking high-level security measures against a major domestic politician like that really bolsters the spoiler assessment.
So this potential political chaos is fueled by economic pain. And that economic pain point for decades was Russia's oldest, most reliable weapon, energy. Gas blackmail, essentially.
Well, that dynamic has fundamentally shifted, and it's actually a huge strategic win for Moldova, though maybe not fully felt yet by everyone. Since late 2022, mainland Moldova, excluding Transnistria for a moment, achieved this historic strategic pivot. They fully decoupled from Russian natural gas. They're now sourcing supplies entirely from European markets. And this was only possible because of massive EU financial support, we should add.
And they're actually cementing that decoupling right now, aren't they? There's a new power line being built connecting Chișinău directly to Romania. It's due for completion in 2025. And this eliminates Moldova's last major energy dependency, which was relying on electricity generated in Transnistria, the Russian-controlled breakaway region.
Exactly. But this long-term strategic success came at a really steep short-term price. The war in Ukraine triggered a deep recession in Moldova. GDP shrank by almost 6%, 5.9% in 2022. And they experienced hyperinflation that peaked at a, frankly, staggering 34.6%.
Wow, 34.6%. That intervening period, that's what the sources call the valley of death, the gap between the immediate economic agony and the potential long-term benefits of EU integration. For an ordinary voter, what does 34.6% inflation actually feel like when they go to the ballot box?
It feels like the price of food, of everything essential, just skyrocketed. It means if you're on a fixed pension, its value effectively dropped by a third almost overnight. It means families struggled, really struggled, with heating bills, with energy costs. And this is the core vulnerability that Russian propaganda exploits so brilliantly. They point to the high cost of living today and dangle the promise of cheap Russian gas tomorrow. Conveniently forgetting, of course, the massive strategic cost of going back to that dependency on the Kremlin.
Speaking of vulnerabilities, we absolutely have to talk about Transnistria, the Russian-occupied breakaway region, home to the operational group of Russian forces, the OGRF.
Right, the OGRF. It's actually a pretty small force, maybe 1,500 troops. Most are locally recruited, not exactly elite soldiers from Russia. They're lightly equipped. Military analysts generally agree it's almost meaningless in a conventional military sense against a modern army. But that's not its main purpose. It remains crucial as a political tripwire. And just a constant source of instability that Moscow can dial up or down whenever it wants.
And those troops also guard the Kubazna ammunition depot, huge place, one of Europe's largest, apparently holding an estimated 20,000 tons of old, decaying Soviet munitions. It's a massive environmental and security risk for the whole region. But what's really fascinating here, according to the sources, is how the economic leverage around Transnistria has shifted recently.
Yes, this is potentially the biggest strategic opening regarding Transnistria in 30 years. For 3 decades, that breakaway region's economy, its whole existence really, was propped up by effectively free Russian gas, supplied through Ukraine via a long-standing transit agreement.
An agreement that's now finished. That model is over.
Completely shattered. That Russia-Ukraine gas transit deal expired on January 1st, 2025. That cut off the gas lifeline. This is genuinely historic. Suddenly, Transnistria finds itself deeply dependent economically on mainland Moldova and, by extension, the EU. Brussels has even offered significant aid, around $60 million, directly to the region.
So the energy crisis, ironically, has flipped the script. It creates this, well, unprecedented opportunity for a stable, pro-European government in Chișinău, an opportunity to use economic carrots rather than military sticks to pursue the peaceful reintegration of Transnistria. The election outcome will basically determine if Chișinău is stable enough and has the political will to actually seize that window.
Exactly right. If the pro-European government consolidates power, they suddenly have this massive, non-military bargaining chip to use with Tiraspol, the Transnistrian capital.
Okay, looking ahead then. The sources lay out 3 pretty clear potential outcomes after the 2025 election, and the result directly impacts wider European security. What's the optimal scenario, the best case?
Scenario 1, pro-European continuity. This means PAS, probably in coalition, successfully governs. They accelerate EU accession, Moldova solidifies itself as a stable buffer state, and remains a strong supporter of Ukraine. That's the ideal outcome for the West.
Okay. Second, the one you flagged is high probability, political paralysis.
Right. This is the fragmented parliament we talked about. No stable majority. It stalls all the necessary reforms, stalls the EU path, creates that power vacuum ripe for Russian exploitation.
Right.
And this is that managed chaos scenario. It's a major strategic win for Moscow, achieved through spoiling tactics and information warfare, rather than direct control.
And scenario 3, the worst case.
Scenario 3 is geopolitical reversal. This would involve a pro-Russian coalition taking power, maybe the BEP bloc plus the spoiler Alternativa. They would actively derail the EU path, start the full Belarusification of the state, and transform Moldova into an active security threat, potentially even a military one, right on Odessa's doorstep.
Right. So if we connect all these dots back to the bigger picture, it really highlights the imperative for Western allies, doesn't it? They need to make sure that $1.9 billion EU reform and growth plan isn't just promised, but delivered quickly, visibly. People need to see tangible benefits, upgraded hospitals, help with energy bills, something to bridge that valley of death of economic hardship before the election, ideally.
Absolutely. And it also requires, potentially, a shift in information strategy from the West and from Moldova itself. The sources strongly recommend moving beyond just reactive debunking of disinformation. They advocate for a proactive strategy of pre-bunking.
Pre-bunking. So instead of just fact-checking a fake story after it spreads, you anticipate it. You sort of warn people ahead of time, like run a campaign saying, expect to hear claims the election is rigged next week. Here's why that narrative serves foreign interests.
That's a perfect way to put it. It's like inoculation, psychological inoculation. By exposing the manipulation technique before this specific piece of disinformation hits, you can neutralize some of its psychological impact. People are prepared for it. And this raises a really important final thought for you, the listener. How effective could this proactive, pre-bunking strategy be if it were applied more broadly? Not just in Moldova, but in other democracies currently facing these advanced hybrid warfare campaigns.
That idea, inoculation against influence, definitely something to mull over as we watch this absolutely critical Moldovan election unfold.
Indeed, it's a really high-stakes moment, not just for Moldova, but for the future shape of Eastern Europe.
You've been listening to The Deep Dive, where we analyze the stories shaping the world. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.